Hey Internet, Elliot from Unlock Audio here, and today we're going to be looking at general audio mixing principles. Now, whether you're someone who is new to mixing and just isn't quite sure why they can't get things to sound the way that they want, or whether you're someone that's dabbled in it a bit but wants a bit more of a definitive thought process to the decisions they make, this will be perfect for you. We'll be looking at how we guide our decision making process, how we can create space, clarity, depth in our mixes, and give us a thought process so we have a very purposeful way in which we make decisions with our mixes. So I have a quick PowerPoint I put together talking about this. Let's dive in. Okay, general mixing principles are how to create audio space. I'm going to end the presentation saying this, and I'm going to start it by saying your goal with a mix is to create clarity and to carve out space for all of the important elements in your mix. The best way for you to make one thing sound good may be to make it sound bad by itself, but in the context of everything else, make it sound fantastic. And there are a number of different ways in which we can create this separation, create this hierarchy, and go for that clarity in our mixes. The first way in which we can do that is called panning. And in our case, I'm just going to focus on stereo panning. So by stereo, I mean we have two channels of audio, a left and a right. And we can place instruments along this stereo field in terms of where we perceive them coming from physically. Does something seem like it's coming from the left or the right or the center? And where is it placed along all of those options? Placing instruments along the stereo field can help create separation between elements that maybe sound really similar to one another. So they have a very similar timbre and they may have a very similar loudness. And if we were to pan them on top of one another, say we put them both in the center, it would be really difficult to hear both of them distinctly and hear any clarity between them. But if we separate them and put one on the far left and the other on the far right, now we can hear that there are two different elements, and it makes it a lot easier for us to clearly hear the differences between them, even if they sound really similar. In terms of panning, there are many ways or many rules of thumb that people have for how you pan things and whatnot, but ultimately it is up to you how you want to place all of your elements. I just grabbed two photos here, images of Googling, stereo placement in a mix. And you can see that there are some things that they have in common, but there are also a lot of things that they are different on. And the point of this is to say that there's no one way you have to do anything. Experiment, have fun, make mistakes. That's the best way to learn. But bear in mind that the entire time that you are making these experiments, that you should be thinking about the outcomes and what that means in terms of the decisions that you make moving forward. If it's not being successful, maybe think about why. And next time, think about panning and placing something differently with that knowledge. Another way that you can create separation between elements is frequency. So every sound that we hear is between 20 and 20,000 hertz. And in my last example, I was talking about stereo panning and how elements may sound really similar in terms of timbre and loudness. When I'm talking about frequency, I'm mostly talking about timbre. So with frequency, you can separate things by making them just have a different character or have a different color or quality of the sound themselves. So that way, even if you have elements that are panned on top of one another, if they sound so different, you can easily hear that they are two different things, and you can easily hear the details in both of them because in terms of frequency, they are not competing with one another. And if you're wondering where certain instruments tend to lie in terms of frequency, there's a graphic on the left there that shows you where certain instruments tend to occupy in terms of frequency, and also kind of the qualities of different instruments and where they tend to live in terms of frequency as well. So if you want more of a shrill, sharp, more pop piano, then you can play around with maybe bumping frequencies from 2K up to about 4K and see what that does. But if you want a really rich and dull but very warm piano, then maybe you should play around with frequencies around 80 to 200 hertz. So these are just some ballparks to give you a head start in your own mixes and experimenting. Another way in which we can create this separation and this clarity is the idea of depth, or how far forward or back something is in the mix. This can be a combination of loudness, it's just literally quieter, and because of frequency, sits further back. It's not as noticeable, but it can also be EQ and reverb as well. So if we have something that is further away from us in the physical world, we hear more of the room, we hear more reverb with that element as opposed to something that's close up to us. Now, there may be artistic and aesthetic reasons as to why we add more reverb and don't really emulate the physical world, but if we want to give the impression of something being further back and farther away, it's probably a bit quieter and it probably has a lot more reverb on it than things that we want to be up front and grabbing our attention. Then another thing is the overall balance of frequency. So I talked about separating individual elements, but this is also true for the overall content of your mix. If you have a lot of elements that tend to have the same frequency content, then it will overall not sound good when you add everything together. Even if you've achieved a fair amount of clarity, if there's so much content that's really low or high or in the middle or whatnot, it'll end up giving you an overall mix that doesn't really sound that good. And if you're wondering how to identify where these problems are, here are some general frequency spectrum shapes that you can use as a guide. So if something has, it just feels muddy and doesn't really have a lot of clarity, then your problem is probably a lot of content in the low end right there. So it may just be turning things down, or it may be actually getting rid of different elements that are occupying that space. If you have something that sounds really hollow overall, even when you have all the instruments in, that may mean that you don't have enough content in your mids. So it can be either a combination of too much in an area and or too little in certain other areas. And I've got all of the frequencies laid out there just to help you give a head start with that. But with that being said, I've been talking about individual elements so far, and ultimately we care about the overall mix. So many times when we hear an amazing, ridiculous guitar solo in a song, if we were to actually mute that guitar solo and hear it on its own, we would think it was kind of lame and thin and just not good sounding. But in the context of every other instrument taking up the lows and the highs and whatever it happens to be, having the guitar solo sit where it does with everything else is what makes the guitar solo sound so good. So you want things to sound good on their own, but what's far more important is making sure that things sound good in context with everything else. So always make sure to be mixing things in context and make them fit together well, as opposed to just make one thing sound good. Last slide here, I said I was going to end with it, and so now I'm ending it. Your goal is clarity. The best way to make one thing sound good is to not focus on making that one thing sound good. Focus on making that thing fit with everything else. So some big things are to think about the hierarchy of your elements. What's important and when is it important, and what do you want your listener to focus on? If you have an element, what role is it filling? Is it grabbing the listener's attention, or is it more so supporting another element? Should it sound like it's in the background? Should it sound like it's in the foreground? Where are you placing it in terms of panning? How can you separate this element as well as other elements? If they sound really similar in terms of timbre, well then maybe I have one sitting really far back and I have it panned far away from the element that seems similar to it. So ideally we can create separation in all of these three dimensions, but if for some reason you can only use two, then make sure that you're using two and thinking about that. If something is more important than others, you may want to give it more space than other elements. So again, this mix can be exactly what you want. Don't think that you have to hear everything with distinct clarity all the time, but make sure that what you want your listener to focus on is clear, does have clarity, and is important in your mix. Okay, I hope this talk was helpful to those that want to think a bit more about creating their own mixes and create a thought process for their mixes themselves. If you want to stay in the loop with Unlock Audio, be sure to sign up for our newsletter. Hit subscribe if you want to know when we have more videos. Be sure to check out unlockaudio.com and see all the cool stuff that we do for games. Thanks so much for watching.